I heard a few of the comments that President Trump made today in Saudi Arabia, and I'll link in the comments section the main summary of those comments that I heard, or the summary that contained the largest set of clips that I've heard. I haven't listened to the whole thing, but I will say that while there's a lot that I disagree with Trump on and about how he's handled things, et cetera, which I've covered in the past, and some things that I'll cover going forward, and even mention some now, I will say that his approach to international affairs has changed my mind or helped crystallize for me some things about how international affairs have been handled for the last 40 or 50 years that I hadn't thought of properly before. I've often kind of thought, I don't think personally that things are going the way they ought to go. That, for example, the whole Iraq war situation, when we went into Iraq, my concerns included that here we are trying to force American values, ideas about democracy and how to govern that took thousands of years to develop until we had 1776. And we think we're just going to force it onto a people with a philosophy and a religion and a way of life that is radically different from ours and radically different from the history out of which our current governing system developed, as if that's okay. Even if we're right, and I think on a lot of ideas we are right, I think over the last few decades, we've substituted the idea of letting people develop their own thoughts and work come to the conclusions that they understand in their own mind and heart are the way to live and the way to think. And we've tried to force them to accept the ideas that we think are in fact proper and ways to govern, ways to live, et cetera, et cetera. We've substituted a philosophy of letting everybody think for themselves and consider all the arguments and live according to the ideas they believe in the end are right. And we've adopted a ends justifies the means approach by talking about liberty and yet using our military and our economic will, et cetera, to try to force people to live the way we think people ought to live. And so there's been a lot of that just has always rubbed me wrong. But throughout most of the last 30 or 40 years, I've just been too busy to stop and think about it, like I would suggest most Americans are. Most of us don't want to spend any more time than we absolutely have to thinking about politics and what's going on in Washington or Austin or whatever the state capital is where you live, or the nation, et cetera. We want to live life. We want to trust that the people we elect to represent us are looking out for the best interest of, in the case of the federal government, the nation as a whole, not even just the representatives looking out for their districts or the senators looking out for their states, but representing their states and their districts' ideas for how the country will best benefit, not how they themselves will best benefit from the country. We need to take John Kennedy's admonition to heart, not just as individuals, but as people in states and in counties and in districts. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But anyway, related to that, it always struck me as odd that we spent so much time being involved in other people's affairs. The first time this kind of came to my attention was Clinton's involvement. Well, I guess actually the first time was when President Reagan, the Iran-Contra affair, and I'm just going to make some general summary or comments on some of these issues, but the general point that had me wondering why conservatives thought that was a good idea was that even though communism, I agree, is not the best choice, and people ought to be offered better alternatives than communism, and communist countries have a horrible track record of how they actually govern their people and the results of communist leadership. When Congress passes a law and there are certain guidelines to be followed, then the president should be leading the charge in executing the laws that Congress passed, whether the president agrees or disagrees, whether the minority in the vote agree or disagree. And that the whole Iran Contra affair struck me as being very un American, even though I might have agreed with the objectives, the means were unjustified, in my opinion. The Clinton involvement in the Balkans and the whole situation over there during that period of quote nation building, that again struck me as an odd objective of the U.S. to use military to force nations to adopt certain positions, directives, etc. And I'm not saying there aren't in certain situations reasons for the U.S. to perhaps become involved, but it's not clear to me that we always are operating with the best of intent or being honest about what's going on, as we often try to pick winners and losers or create winners and losers by our actions, as if we have a right to decide for people how, in fact, they ought to be governed and under what circumstances they ought to live. Because I would suggest that most people would probably just as soon live without the United States military in their backyard. And the fact that perhaps we are in places where we are, it would appear, needed to keep the peace, then we have to ask, what is it about the ideas that we are supposedly putting out in the world that is unattractive to the people we talk to the degree that a majority cannot simply um, take control of their own nations, their own governments, their own situations to operate in the same way we do. And if there's a reason that they think our way is not the right way, um, should we be part of the process of them working towards their own best ends? The next thing, I guess that again, I already mentioned the Iraq War and that whole situation. Um, but all this to say that, given my concern and effort recently to pay a little more attention to politics, the statement by Trump, many of the statements by Trump, I think represent what is, in fact, the best way to approach the United States place in the world. I disagree with the $1 trillion military budget. I think that we need to force Pentagon and every other body of government to operate in a more fiscally prudent manner. And I'll address this more in another video, just the whole debacle, the Doge debacle, the Doge Dodge, as we are not realizing even a fraction of the potential that I had hoped would be realized with the Doge effort. I think Vivek Ramaswamy would have, his plan would have resulted in much more effective governance, but it appears Congress is not willing to actually do anything to address the issues that are identified. So I disagree with the $1 trillion proposed military budget. I think we need to get the budget to that we have to at least pass an audit, and in the process analyze what in fact all the money that's already being spent on defense is being spent on before we just give them more money. There are always dangers in the world, but I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole right now. But anyway, I just want to emphasize that President Trump has sounded what I think is a much more reasonable approach, and I think that an analysis of the last 30 years, particularly post fall of the Soviet Union, would suggest that if we had handled things diplomatically in our actions in relation to Russia and even China in a more conciliatory way with respect to reaching out to the people of these nations as people interested in peace and trade, science, etc., that we would not find ourselves in the place we are today, that I think in large part was fostered by the military industrial complex and leadership that I think has not done the U.S. and the world any favors with respect to creating an environment for peace. Thank you all very much. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Bye bye. Thank you very much for your time. I've got a couple other videos listed here if you'd like to take a look at those and as I'd like to discuss issues related to politics, religion, society, and how in the world we're supposed to understand ourselves and life in the world. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye bye.